Nazi occultism and magic really is an interesting subject, and it really does go to show the terrible things that can happen when idiots mess around with magic that they don't understand. I know that there are many people who think that the Nazis and certain members of the High Command were masters of occultism, but I would argue that they really didn't have a fucking clue what they were doing. In my opinion, they were far from masters and were actually more dabblers in the subject. If they really had even half a clue about real magic, I would imagine the Second World War would have turned out a lot differently. Now, I'd like to start by saying I don't much like Nazi cults. I don't subscribe to that sort of ideology, and I don't like totalitarianism in general. So I'm not going to be referring to Nazis or the Nazi Party or movement, basket of rotten eggs, whatever you want to call them, in a particularly nice way. If that offends you, then I suggest you may wish to stop watching this video and move on to something else. All documentaries are biased. Not that I'd really call this a documentary, but I'm not going to apologize for giving you my opinion here. I'm going to give you my perspective, that being the perspective of a modern day witch, cunning man / occultists, in regard to Nazi magic and the crazy shit they used to get up to during the Second World War. I understand that not everyone, in fact most people watching this, are going to have no background in real magic, and that those which do may not agree with me, but at the end of the day, I can only give you my opinion and it's based on personal experience. So let's cut to the chase and talk about some of the crazy Nazi magic, crazy Nazi science, and of course, crazy Nazi rotten crazy shit. Crazy Nazi shit. Let's talk about that. Now, I guess in order to start, we need to understand a little bit about the main man behind it all, Adolf Hitler. Talk about a man with a god complex. Hitler, from the very beginning, used faith of the German people and twisted the dominant religion at the time into something new he could control. Which is interesting as the most powerful person in Christianity at the time, the Pope, seemingly did nothing. In March 1939, as the world was balancing on the brink of war, the College of Cardinals gathered to elect a new Pope that they hoped would be strong enough to stop the oncoming Nazi storm. Cardinal Pacelli was elected as Pope Pius XII, but after 2 weeks of him being elected, the Nazis are on the march, tearing down the borders created in World War I. Hitler is no stranger to the new Pope, however, who has in fact been watching Hitler's rise to power for many years. In 1917, while Pacelli was papal envoy assigned to Munich, he witnessed the rise of communism and the background or political climate that was necessary for Hitler to rise to power. Originally, Hitler marketed himself as a Christian who held Christian principles, but eventually it became apparent that he really viewed himself as the new Messiah. He thought of himself as Jesus, something clearly in opposition to the standard doctrine of the Catholic Church. Hitler and the Nazi Party immediately began trying to purge itself of all things it didn't consider to be German and pure, and legitimized bigotry. On the 10th of May 1923, they urged students to burn all books which were not considered authentically German. The first concentration camps opened in 1933, and still the Catholic Church and the Pope at the time does and says nothing. Eventually, in July of 1933, Pacelli begins work on a treaty between the Church and the German state, the Nazis in other words. Eventually, they worked out a deal known as the Concord Act, which guaranteed the Catholic Church in Germany certain rights and keeping them out of state matters, essentially. By negotiating with the Nazi Party, in the eyes of many, the Catholic Church have been accused of endorsing the discrimination of other races, although I would say, given the ways the Nazis dealt with other religious people, such as the Jehovah's Witnesses, it was most likely a choice between cutting a deal with them or having all the Catholics rounded up with the Jewish people and sent to concentration camps. The Nazis didn't have any intention of holding up their end of the deal, with violations happening from the start. After all, Hitler appeared to be trying to start and create his own religion, a new German religion out of a warped kind of Christianity. This new religion would allow him to carry out unspeakable atrocities. For his new religion, Hitler and the Nazis started to reword and rework the ideas of Christ, making Jesus reflect himself and trying to paint him as a violent and anti-Semite. He basically tried to make out Jesus came to destroy the Jews and made it clear that he, Hitler, was the new replacement for Jesus, charged with the task of finishing the work that he thought Jesus failed to complete, basically taking people from Judaism and converting them into Christianity, or at least Hitler's idea of Christianity. And when I say conversion, it was more of a case of killing them. Before a shot had even been fired in World War II, the Catholic Church is in a fight for its survival. Through the 1930s, Hitler does his best to undermine Christianity and even creates his own church, the National Reich Church, which was designed to teach a simple doctrine compatible with a national socialism. Hitler turned to Ludwig Miller to lead his new religion and to test out his up-and-coming religion and how it could basically be carved out of an existing Christianity, just without all the Judaism and former Christian values that might make people question the treatment of those the Nazis considered impure. The idea was to rewrite the Bible and purge the Bible of anything Jewish, of course meaning it essentially has to scrap the entire Old Testament. The redesigned church, of course, kept Jesus at the core, but kind of tried to surround him with figures from Germany's past. An opportunity presented itself eventually with the Night of the Long Knives, a purge of any rivals and prominent Catholics within the Nazi Party. This is a trend with dictators, as they always try to eliminate any threats and eventually get more and more nervous about who they can trust, even within their own inner kind of circle. Many ceremonies were replaced with older pagan equivalents, such as pagan burial styles or naming ceremonies, in an effort to remove anything that could be sort of perceived as Jewish from what was left of the Christian religion in Hitler's new church. After eliminating his enemies, Hitler was free to start spreading his new religion and will throughout the land. In the summer of 1934, he grants access to a filmmaker to record his Nuremberg rally. It presented Hitler as the light against the dark, I suppose, and gave the Nazi Party a very kind of religious tone. To die for Germany was the new martyrdom. The nation is the new church, and to die for it is kind of the purpose of any good citizen. People even ran up to Hitler in order to get touched by him as they thought he had the power to heal. People got swept up in this. Tell someone something enough times, they'll start to believe it, and this is what happened. It's the type of brainwashing that many cult leaders use. Many people made the mistake of not taking Hitler seriously when he attacked the Jews. They didn't think he would really do the things that he was kind of saying that he'd do, and certainly things as catastrophic as he ended up actually doing. Of course, when they found out he was serious, they were mostly too scared to act. Many who weren't directly affected did nothing until, of course, more and more people were targeted by the Nazis. In fact, there's a very, very famous saying, first they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. On the 10th of February 1939, Pope Pius XI died, and the College of Cardinals gathered to elect a new pope. The one the Nazis didn't want, in fact, was elected. In the eyes of the Church, God's representative on the earth, Pope Pius XII, was greatly opposed to the Nazis, who called Pacelli the Pope of the Jews, in fact. Once Pope Pacelli came to power, he decided to bug the Vatican, I believe, as he knew there were many Nazi spies within the Catholic Church. In August of 1939, Hitler orders the eradication of Polish priests and discussed the invasion of Poland. Hitler wanted to kill as many Catholic priests in Poland as they could. Pacelli made the decision, despite the dangers, to help try and assassinate Hitler. He gives the conspirators his blessing, essentially, to go ahead with the assassination. This means the Vatican has officially broken its promise and stance of neutrality. The plot and attempt to assassinate Hitler ultimately failed, which just kind of fueled Hitler, who believed he was under a supernatural protection. On the 25th of July in 1943, Hitler's ally Mussolini is removed from power and troops are sent to occupy Rome, surrounding the Vatican. Machine guns were directed towards the Pope's apartment, and the Catholic Church hasn't been more vulnerable than it has been for centuries. Hitler turned to Karl Wolff for a plan to destroy the Catholic Church and wanted kind of what-if scenarios. For example, what would happen if we just kidnapped the Pope? Eventually, Rome was taken by the Allied forces, and it appeared the Vatican would be safe for now. Yet more assassination attempts were made on Hitler, but again, none were really successful. And this just kind of helped Hitler reinforce the idea he was under divine protection. History has judged the Catholic Church harshly for not condemning the Nazis, but it really seems to be a catch-22 situation. On the one hand, if they did take the moral high ground and moved against Hitler, then many Catholics would have been rounded up and killed along with the Jewish people. But on the other hand, if they intervened in the beginning and not stayed quiet, well, I wonder what could have happened. I know this video is called Crazy Nazi Magic and Witchcraft, but I thought it was important to kind of set the scene of exactly how important the religious element was to the Nazi agenda. So many people don't know the full extent of the Nazi occult magical practices due to them being suppressed during the Nuremberg trials. If you don't know much about the Nuremberg trials, basically at the end of the Second World War, after the Allied forces liberated the concentration camps and arrested all the many Nazi scumbags, the Nazis were put on trial. The problem was that occult practices and beliefs were very widespread among the Nazis, and especially high-ranking Nazi officials. It was thought that too much talk of magic and occultism would possibly be grounds for a lot of them to plead insanity. After all, some of the crazy things that they did believe, most people today would think you're crazy for believing that, throw them in an insane asylum. And we now know just how much the organisers and judges tried to censor the witnesses, their testimonies, and the Nazis on trial, literally cutting certain people off mid-sentence if the official record would have reflected anything too quote-unquote crazy. This was simply because many wanted those Nazis basically convicted and executed for their hideous crimes. I should mention, though, that despite convictions, many Nazis with a background in science escaped / were snatched up by the United States in an effort to help with the space program and to help with many top secret programs during the Cold War. This was known as Operation Paperclip. Seriously, you can look it up. What Nazi scientists the US didn't snatch up, the Russians managed to get. But this was yet another subject we have only found out years later due to, public information laws and that. The Nazis were obsessed with the supernatural long before their rise to power. In fact, during World War II, Hitler had an interest in Norse paganism and wrote poetry to the Norse gods. In the trenches of World War I, Hitler actually had a dream whilst he was an officer and basically dreamt that he was killed by a shell and awoke with the feeling he had to leave the trench he was in. He decided to run into no man's land, which would be basically crazy. Um, but in actual fact, what happened was a few minutes later, after having done it, a bomb actually fell on the trench that he was just lying in and obviously would have killed him and unfortunately, or fortunately, killed the comrades that he was with in that trench. Hitler took this prophetic kind of dream as a sign from the gods that he was chosen for great things. And indeed, he believed that he was under the protection of the gods. Of course, as I've mentioned before, this feeling of kind of divine protection would be reinforced time and time again due to many failed assassination attempts later in his life. At the end of World War I, Germany lost everything, and the country was in ruin with no real national identity, and it had no confidence and no respect. This was something Hitler would eventually exploit and use to rally people to support him. At the time, the general public had a fascination with many forms of occultism, including astrology, spiritualism, and seances. One especially successful and a famous astrologer was Erich von Hasen, who offered many occult services to well-paying clients. Hasen set up what he called a Palace of the Occult in Berlin, which became a very popular place frequented by many members of Berlin's high society. Hasen was famous at the time for being able to accurately predict the future, such as the results of the AVUS Grand Prix. At his height, and despite being Jewish, he entertained many of Germany's military and business elite, also becoming close friends with members of the SA. Hanussen was asked to teach Hitler, in fact, public speaking, basic crowd control, and even perhaps some suggest mind control techniques, something Hitler would put to great use throughout the rest of his life to captivate his audiences and followers. As many people know, Hitler was considered to be a great public speaker, and you can go online and see some of the speeches that he'd give. You can see the techniques that he uses or used, and you can see how the crowd gets swept away with the passion that he puts into the words. Is a big thing amongst cult leaders. They generally are very charismatic and very good public speakers. Hanussen would eventually go on to predict Hitler's rise to the office of Chancellor, which many have pointed out probably contributed greatly to the campaign. After all, a well-known psychic tells his followers that something's going to happen, and they kind of go and make it happen. If Hanussen says Hitler's going to win, you might as well vote for him, then a lot of his followers will go and do exactly that. He would eventually make an even bolder prediction, the Rothstein fire, which is basically Germany's parliament building, and sure enough it caught fire within 20 hours of his prediction being made public. Not too long after, though, Hanussen winds up dead. At this time, there are two main factions in the Nazi Party, those being the believers in the occult, and then those being the skeptics. Hitler himself was opposed to astrology, although he was very superstitious, and Hitler, of course, believed he had a direct connection to the gods. And so I guess he kind of never really felt any need to study astrology because he felt that he was always going to be on the right path. He kind of felt that his future was preordained, that he was basically under the protection of the gods. So I guess he figured, what can astrology possibly do for me? Hitler believed he could already control things through his own will or even through occult relics. One such relic was the Spear of Destiny, which, for those who don't know what it is, it's believed to be the spear which pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion. It's believed that he who wields it in battle is indestructible. If you want to become a king, then of course you need the Spear of Destiny, and so Hitler decided that he'd try and track it down. The day the Germans invaded Poland, an astrologer by the name of Ernst Kraft predicts a failed assassination attempt on Hitler's life. It was at this time the Nazis started to use the widely held belief in astrology to help create Nazi propaganda. One such piece of propaganda was a fake book that they made appear to be written by Nostradamus. It makes sense if you have a large group of people who believe in astrology and seem to live their lives by what the stars say, that this might be a useful tool to control them. Of course, it didn't take the opposition long to adopt the same tactics, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill adopted a similar strategy by creating fake astrological almanacs, which would predict the fall of Hitler and the Nazi parties. They then dropped them over Germany by airplane in the hopes that the Germans would lose faith in the Nazi party and that it may start to falter. The Allied forces didn't stop there, though. When British intelligence officers targeted Hitler's right-hand man, Rudolf Hess, who was also massively into the occult, he was very much into astrology. The Special Operations Unit employed astrologers to create fake astrological charts to be sent to Hess. I don't think they mailed him in the post, obviously. It would have been one of those things which they made him aware of these charts so that he'd take an interest. They were designed to make Hess believe he had to travel to England for a meeting which would secure the success of the Nazi Party. This was actually known as Operation Mistletoe, and believe it or not, Hess actually fell for it. He got a plane to take him to Scotland and then parachuted in. Obviously, when he hit the ground, he was immediately arrested, of course. As a quick side story, I actually had a friend who was responsible for guarding Rudolf Hess at one point when he was a young army officer. I think he was stationed in Western Berlin, so shout out to Rich if you're listening to this. You're probably not, but I thought I'd say hello anyway. Also, another quick little interesting story, I'm not sure I believe this one, was that famous occultist Aleister Crowley invented the signature V for Victory sign Winston Churchill used to use. Crowley had apparently said it was designed to counter the magic of the Nazi swastika, but I would hardly call Aleister Crowley reliable, let's be fair. Hitler didn't take the arrest of Hess very well and ordered the rounding up of all astrologers and even Freemasons to be sent to concentration camps, kind of as revenge. It did make the Nazi Party look quite stupid, given the second in command was just, well, arrested by the Allies by flying directly into their jurisdiction, country. Gotta be embarrassing, let's be fair. Despite this, though, there were some who were believed to be authentic scientists studying the occult, and they were ordered to assist the Nazi Party with understanding the deeper mysteries of the occult. Hitler was still very skeptical of astrology, but strangely he did believe in the work of Hans Hodbringer, which was often referred to as world ice theory. And to quote Wikipedia, a very reliable source of course, the theory goes something like this. According to the idea, the solar system has its origin in a gigantic star into which a smaller, dead, waterlogged star fell. This impact caused a huge explosion that flung fragments of a smaller star out into an interstellar space where the water condensed and froze into a giant block of ice. A ring of such blocks formed that we now call the Milky Way, apparently, as well as a number of solar systems, among which was our own, but with many more planets than currently exist today. Interplanetary space is filled with traces of hydrogen gas, which cause the planets to slowly spiral inwards, along with ice blocks. The outer planets are large mainly because they have swallowed a large number of ice blocks, but the inner planets have not swallowed nearly as many. One can see ice blocks on the move in the form of meteors, of course, and when one collides with the Earth, it produces hailstorms over an area of many square kilometers or miles. Well, when one falls into the sun, it produces a sunspot and gets vaporized, making fine ice that covers the innermost planets. It was also claimed that the Earth had several satellites before it acquired the Moon, because it acquired the Moon, okay? They began as planets in orbits of their own, but over long spans of time were captured one by one and slowly spiraled in towards the Earth until it disintegrated and its debris became part of the Earth's structure. One can supposedly identify the rock strata of several geological areas with the impacts of these satellites. In other words, what he basically thought was that the sky was made of ice and that there were giants which lived there long ago. Offshoot ideas by Herbringer's followers actually linked the flood described in the Bible and the kind of Atlantis flooding theory slash story to the fall of prior moons. It wasn't just astrologers which were used by the Nazis. Dowsers were also used to find British ships thought to be going after German U-boats. These dowsers used pendulum dowsing, but the German dowsing program was also expanded later through the SS, and special officers were trained to use dowsing to find anything from mythological relics or occult relics to water and even gold. Many people may find this incredibly strange, but dowsing is still used to this day. I have experienced in the construction industry where I have known dowsers to be used to find buried pipes and cables and that sort of thing. Doesn't work most of the time, but you know. When Heinrich Himmler finally gained power over the weapons development program, Himmler was essentially Adolf Hitler's right hand. He was the second in command of the Nazis, basically. Great resources were given to Himmler for him to work with Germany's top scientists in order to create supernatural weapons, such as the ones believed to have been used by the Aryans who, so say, ruled Atlantis, according to the German Nazis. Perhaps one of Hitler's biggest screw-ups that we can be grateful for was a dream he had one night that the new V2 rocket shot into space and shattered a block of ice, which then destroyed the new world he was trying to create, basically destroying Germany. Due to this dream, in fact, Hitler postponed the V2 program in order for German scientists to check the dream would not actually come true. Of course, this set the German rocket program back considerably, and it would be interesting what could have possibly happened if that never actually occurred. So if there was no postponement in the rocket program, we could all be speaking German right now. Right, now I think it's time to talk about the werewolves, and yeah, I mean werewolves. Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, and Hitler needed a movement within the Reich in the name of the organization they come up with was Operation Werewolf. After all, European folklore surrounding wolves, there's a lot of it. It's also said the wolves are supposedly fearless and valiant, able to defeat their arch enemy, vampires, and vampires, of course, are thought to be kind of Slavic, evil. Hitler kind of likened them to Jews. So essentially, you've got the werewolves which versus the vampires, or the Nazis versus the Jews. The Nazi wolves were created to stage a last-ditch battle as the Nazis were losing the war against invading Allied forces. Uh, what they basically did was try to create a force which could protect the potential leaders of a Fourth Reich. The wolves are mainly Nazi youths trained to live in the forests to keep Nazi movement going after Germany is officially defeated. They even had their own werewolf radio station at one point, with the final episode airing on the 23rd of March 1945. Joseph Goebbels himself gave the final address, urging the German people to sink their teeth into the enemy. The show also ended, funnily enough, with a howl of a wolf. It was finally at the very end of the war, just before Hitler committed suicide, that Goebbels become almost crazy. Not that he wasn't crazy before, but I mean, he really kicked things up a notch here. He basically started spending more and more time poring over astrological charts to find out the future of the Nazis. He eventually became German Chancellor, in fact, but only held the office for a single day. Obviously, we know Hitler committed suicide, but before he committed suicide, he actually apparently ordered his corpse and the corpse of his wife, who also committed suicide at the time, saying that they both should be burned. And some have speculated this was possibly due to him actually believing that if he burned, so would Germany. Physically burn, that is. In other words, it's kind of like saying, if I can't have the world, then no one else can. Maybe he actually believed that, given that he thought he was like kind of the new Messiah, if he died, then the destruction of his body would trigger the destruction of the world. But let's be fair, it was more likely because he didn't want his body to be mutilated when the Allies found it. There are many conspiracy theorists that believe Hitler didn't actually commit suicide and that this was just a decoy for him to escape, but who knows? I would imagine he probably did actually commit suicide. I don't think that he is hiding in Antarctica on a UFO like some people believe. General George Patton was the man who commanded the US forces as they invaded Berlin, and he was said to be just as into the occult as Hitler and the Nazis were. Under a chapel in Nuremberg, a hidden bunker was constructed by the Nazis with a hidden entrance through an antique shop. What's in the bunker? Well, it had stored within it secret occult items, such as the Spear of Destiny that the Nazis apparently actually found. I know this sounds like something out of Indiana Jones, but honestly, this actually happened. General George Patton found the entrance of this bunker due to an informant or captured prisoner revealing the information, and he dispatched a special squad to investigate it, which of course they eventually did. And after the spear was found, it was sent back to Austria as a kind of symbolic gesture. Now, Nuremberg is a very strange place. In fact, the entire landscape was reconfigured to resemble the legendary Spear of Destiny, which of course points to the chapel where the relic itself was hidden. It's one of those things, and of course, if you're going to hide something, then why not spend ridiculous amounts of money kind of leaving clues? Da Vinci Code, if you've ever read that book, those kind of clues to point exactly where he hid in all of the treasure. Now, I think it's time that we talked about Wilsberg Castle, as this is where I think it starts getting really interesting. Now, Wewelsburg Castle is located in the village of Wewelsburg, and it was used mainly by Himmler and the SS, and some very strange occult rituals took place there. The SS was kind of like the elite faction of the Nazis, and everything about it screams to me secret society. There were initiation rites performed, hidden ranks, and it's kind of like an evil, more serious version of the Masons. It's difficult to know exactly what magic the SS got up to, given that they were directly under the command of Himmler, and it is thought even actually Adolf Hitler himself didn't really know what they were getting up to in the castle. Himmler was obsessed with the origins of the Germanic people and an Aryan supergiant race of people who were supposedly technologically advanced, which Germans were supposedly, you know, evolved from. He selected Aryan people to join his elite SS group, and although we talked about Hitler creating his own religion, this S cult, which is the only thing I can really call it at this point, was much deeper down the rabbit hole and much darker than perhaps even Adolf Hitler himself. Within the chambers of the castle, you can see carved runes, possibly designed to communicate with the divine. Runes are kind of early alphabet, but are used for many things in the occult and in magic, from divination to the creation of doorways and gateways to other worlds. They're also said to retain power, um, give things a certain energetic charge. You can, of course, find many carvings within the walls of the Wilsberg Castle, including the notorious Black Sun, a symbol whose meaning is truly so dark I can't really go into it in this lecture. It really requires an entire lecture all on its own, which I might do at some point. From what I can tell, Himmler used the castle not only as the headquarters of the SS, but mainly to perform occult experiments, which should supposedly have given the SS great powers over magic and the occult. One of the subjects Himmler was interested in was necromancy, so the art of raising and communicating with the dead, and of course past lives. Himmler himself thought he was a reincarnation of Heinrich the Fowler, a duke from Saxony from around the year 912, I think it was. It was knowledge he apparently acquired from past lives that led him to believe the key to accessing powers once lost by the German people was to purge the blood of the master race. Of course, meaning killing everyone who didn't match up to his idea of what the perfect German might look like. If you think Hitler subscribed to the kind of Aryan race model, then Himmler was a lot deeper and a lot darker, and a lot of the, ideals of Nazi perfection actually came from Himmler and not so much Hitler. Um, SS officers, already being considered pure, or at least to meet the minimum standard of purity, were given incentives to procreate, even going so far as to encourage SS officers to cheat on their wives and giving them money to support their many children. In a famous statement, in fact, Himmler made he basically recommended his men have sex in certain graveyards to infuse the birth with the power of German ancestors. Himmler looked at the remains of his master race in Tibet, so he basically sent SAS, shouldn't say that, SS teams to investigate, but they found nothing. Probably the strangest thing they did, although they did many strange things to kind of find what was left of the giants or gods of the German people, was actually to dig a giant hole to the center of the earth in Hungary, of all places. The project cost literally millions, and well, they obviously didn't actually get there, they just ended up digging a massive hole. After the war eventually ended, the Allied forces found many creepy objects, projects, and stashes of occult objects, even coffins containing dead Nazis and people from history that the Nazis considered to be useful for the transmutation process designed to bring back the race of giants. Of course, the SAS were really trying to bring back these giants. They were trying to purify themselves through many different forms of magic, and gain occult knowledge and essentially superpowers. Who really knows what else could be out there undiscovered or maybe even hidden in private collections? The only reason we know most of the stuff discussed today is due to the Freedom of Information Act and knowledge kind of now only just becoming available. So I know I've only touched on a couple of subjects in this lecture, but thanks for listening, and who knows, maybe we'll focus on some other occult subjects that are kind of relevant to this, or maybe go into more detail in later videos. But thank you very much for listening, and I would really appreciate if you could like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you and goodbye.